Welcome back to the ChessGoals YouTube channel. In today's video, we're going to go over the candidates prediction article that I wrote for chess.com called Candidates 2022. What do the numbers say? I'm going to put chapters in this video, so if you want to jump from segment to segment, you can. I'm going to read it word for word and then add a few thoughts as I go. So the 2022 FIDE Candidates tournament will occur in Madrid, Spain from June 16th through July 5th of this year. The tournament will consist of 8 qualified players, and the winner earns the right to challenge Grandmaster Magnus Carlsen for the World Champion title. This article uses Smarter Chess Predictions brought to you by ChessGoals.com. Hey, that's us. To calculate each player's odds of winning the event. We'll first cover the statistical models and then dive into the breakdowns for each player. So first I talk about how I build these statistical models. These are done in Excel, and I use a whole bunch of random numbers that I generate to feed the models. But first I had to figure out which factors go into the model. So what I did was I went all the way back to the candidates tournament in 2013 when Carlsen qualified for the championship, and I used all of that data to help predict who's going to be the candidate for this year. So previous events had 14 rounds with an average rating between 2770 and 2787. So pretty narrow range, definitely in the upper 2700s. I looked at birth year, peak rating, the peak year of their highest rating, how many points off their peak they are, and how many years off their peak. So I wanted to see like if players were in their prime, if that mattered, if their age mattered, how far off their prime, and how long off their prime. And for peak ratings, I only looked prior to that event date. So you can't look at future data to build a model. You can only look at that candidate's tournament from the past and then their ratings prior to that. It'd be cheating to look ahead at their ratings. So all of those factors were in consideration for a model. And the most important predictors in order, number one, current rating. And I think this is how most people base their predictions or simulations. They look at current ELO rating and they use that to estimate probabilities of winning or losing games. That is the most important factor. Number two is peak rating prior to the event. Number three is age. And number four is years away from their peak rating. So how far off their prime are they? Factors three and four were not statistically significant and only affected the performance ratings by about 1 ELO point each. So really not even worth including in the model. I think that was adding unnecessary noise to the model. But both current and peak ratings had a positive association with predicted performance rating in the upcoming candidates tournament. So that's what we're going to use. We're just looking at these two factors, current rating at the time of the event and the peak rating before the event. And I really like peak rating because intuitively that makes sense to me. To win a candidates tournament, you're going to need to be performing at a very high rating. You're going to have to be at the top of that field of really strong players, right? So I'm thinking you're going to need like a 2820 rating most likely, performance rating or higher. So if your peak rating is 2790, let's say, it's going to be tough for you to perform at the very highest level to defeat all the other candidates to end up getting first place. The next thing I did to run simulations, I calculated the implied win, loss, and draw odds for every single game and applied those random numbers to determine a result. So those are the numbers I talked about previously. Every single game has a random number assigned, and then that random number falls into the odds of a win, a loss, or a draw. So each individual game is predicted. After summarizing all 56 games for one tournament situation, I check if there's one clear winner, a tie, and if there's a tie, then we got to go to the tiebreakers, which gets a little bit more complicated. So it's 56 games in the tournament. Each one is individually simulated based on the predicted rating. So that's where you see some variance introduced into this, right? There's random variation. Any player can win, but the players with the higher projected ratings are going to tend to win more often. So I took those 56 games to build one tournament and I reran that 1,000 times. So 1,000 tournaments were simulated, 56,000 games, and that determined the final odds and the results that are projected. The draw rate for the simulations was about 69% of the matches played. This nice histogram chart shows the winning score in the classical portion. So the most common score that ended up winning was 8.5 points, followed by 9 points. You can see over here on the left the number of simulations that number of points occurred to win the classical. And after 9 points, it's 8 points, and then 9.5. And really, you don't see very many occurrences where 7.5 can win. That makes sense. 7 is a 50% score. That's only +1. And 10 is going to be very difficult to achieve. That's +1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's a +6 score, 10 out of 14. So I think you're going to pretty much need between 8 and 9.5 points to win the event. And the most common winning score in the classical sim was 8.5. Yep, we talked about that. The average winning classical score was 8.7 points. So the player has to have an ability to play at a very high level to win this event. Next, we have the results. We will start with the lowest projected finishers in the simulations and work our way up to the highest projected finishers. These are using the April 2022 FIDE ratings for the numbers listed below, but I did feed live ratings at the time of the models for their current rating. I just wanted to have something consistent with published ratings for these headers. Jan-Krzysztof Duda, 2750, projected to score 6 out of 14. That's his most common score in the simulations, and he won 4% of the events. He's a 23-year-old with the lowest FIDE rating in the event, 2750. His peak is only 2760. So he hasn't really shown that he can perform at that 2800 plus level. And I have here 2810 plus required to win the candidates tournament. He won 29 of the events in the classical, 9 out of 23 ties, totaling 38 wins in 1,000 simulations. So I'm rounding this 4%. Really, you can just say 38 divided by 1,000. That's 3.8% of the time he's winning. His most likely score is 6 points, an average of 6.2. And we can't count him out here, I mentioned, because he did qualify by winning the World Cup. So winning the World Cup shows that he has some potential, of course, to do well and potentially win the candidates. And I think really anyone who qualified for this tournament had to do so by doing something extraordinary. And that means that they have a chance to win this event. Jan-Krzysztof, lowest odds to win, 4%. Richard Rapport, FIDE rating 2776, projected 6.5 out of 14, 5% chance to win. Very similar to Duda, one of the younger players in the field. He doesn't have a very high peak rating. And I have here, it's unlikely that a player can come into a candidates tournament at their peak rating and win if their peak rating isn't over 2800. So he's currently at his peak. He's been on fire, but his peak rating is only 2776. So he won 37 events, 12 in the tiebreakers, totaling 49. And he got second place in the FIDE Grand Prix with very strong performances in Berlin and Belgrade. And yeah, I mentioned here, it's kind of exciting that the two longest shots in the field are both young players that could just surprise these cold-hearted statistical models, right? These guys both have some passion. They both can play exciting chess, and they could easily surprise us here. Next, we have Teimour Radjabov. His FIDE rating, 2753, projected 6.5 out of 14, 8% to win. He was the youngest grandmaster in history back in 2001 when he earned the title at age 14. He had a peak rating of 2793 back in 2012. That's 10 years ago. The high peak performance rating does bump up his odds a bit over the previous two players, but he still hasn't reached the 2800 plus mark. So 2793, 10 years ago, that's still not going to quite cut it to win the candidate. So he's really going to have to do something special in this event to be able to win the whole thing. Jan Nepomniachtchi. He just played in the last World Championship match, 2773. He's projected for 7 out of 14, 8% to win. And he did show that he had a very impressive performance in the last candidates tournament. But let's see. Magnus was able to win four of the last 6 games in their last championship match to end up winning 7.5 to 3.5. But in the first 5 games, Nepo was right there with Magnus. So he proved he can play really strong. But can he hold that performance again in the candidates tournament with this very strong field? And as we'll see, a couple players coming up have to be really tough competition for Nepo to get through in order to win this event. He averaged 6.8 points in the simulations, won 78 simulated events, and he did get a slight bump in the tiebreak odds due to his strong rapid rating of 28-21. So rapid rating comes into play if the players tie. Depending on if there's 2 players, there's a certain tiebreaker. If there's 3 or more, there's a different tiebreaker. But rapid and potentially blitz come into play during a tie. So that could favor Nepo if there's a tie for first. Alireza Firouzja. I think this is the player that everyone wants to see do well, whether they want him to win or not. Magnus wants to see Alireza win. He has mentioned that he might not play for the World Championship if Alireza isn't the challenger. He's been on a tear recently, but his current tournament that he's in, he's not doing quite as well, at least in the first couple of rounds. So it'll be interesting to see how he does in this field against very top players. He's proven that he can crush players below 2,700 or in the low 2,700s, and that's what skyrocketed his rating up to 2,800. But can he hang with these guys, the very top players in the world? And not just hang with them, can he outperform them? I know he can hang with them, but can he show that he could score that 8.5 points or so out of 14? He's the youngest player in the field, 18 years old. I have a note here. If you want to give some heat for these predictions, message Danny Wrench. And yeah, his current rating is 2804, peak rating 2804. That's very strong. But we've only had 3 other players. Oh, sorry. We have 3 other players in this event with a history of being rated 2816 or higher. And historically, players have also been at the top longer than Firouzja before winning the candidates event. His most common score was 50% with an average of 7.3. So this part's a little bit confusing. He won 14% of the simulations. I'm sorry, 15% of the simulations. Hikaru won 14% of the simulations, who's up next. But on the most common score for Alireza was 7 points, and the most common score for Hikaru was 7.5. So that's just a little bit of differences. It's essentially a tie between these two, but it just depends on how those random models were run, right? It just happened to fall that way. 1% higher for Alireza, but half a point higher for Nakamura was most common. Now we get to Naka. And I have here that he's in a virtual tie with Alireza. He won 144 events out of 1,000. And I think Nakamura is very exciting. I believe he's the dark horse in the event, could surprise everyone if he comes in with a 2,800 plus performance. He was number 2 in the world at age 27, and he had a 2816 FIDE rating. And the average age of the last 5 winners was 30. So being that he's 34 years old, may mean that this is his last chance to qualify for the World Championship. It's really hard to get into the candidates. I think this is Hikaru's year. If he's going to do it, he's got to win this year. Liren. So now we're getting up to the 2 favorites, in my opinion. I think Hikaru and Alireza are kind of tier 2 in this event, right? 3rd and 4th. Now we're on to tier 1. Liren, 2797 FIDE, projected 7.5, 21% odds to win. He is the last qualifier for the event, second highest FIDE rating in the field after his recent flurry of tournaments to make sure that he qualified. He's been so consistent that he's probably the gambling favorite once those sites pick up on his qualification. And that's because his FIDE rating is so high in addition to being consistent, right? Alireza's FIDE rating is higher, but he hasn't hung around that 2,800 for nearly as long as Liren. The other player that's been at the top for almost or just as long, probably even stronger, is Fabiano Caruana, a stronger stretch, I should say. But recently, he hasn't done quite as well. A bit of a slump. Ding won 157, though, in the Classical and 49 in the tiebreaks, getting him to 206 victories. And that falls just a little bit shy of Fabiano. And Ding's average score, the most likely score, was 7.5 points. So that's not his average, that's his mode score. That's the most common score in the simulations. Now we get to number 1, Fabiano Caruana. He's already qualified before to face Magnus, and he had a very tight match. He was actually tied in the Classical and went to tie breaks. 2781 rating. He's been a consistent 2800 plus. I think this 2780 is a little bit misleading. Projected 8 out of 14, 26% to win. And the reason that he's scoring an impressive 7.7 average with a most common score of 8 is because of his peak rating of 2844 back in 2014. So in simulations, he won 197 events in the Classical, 62 in the tiebreaker, totaling 259 tournament victories out of 1,000. So he's winning over 1/4 of the simulations. So he is definitely the favorite to win it all based on these models and based on these simulations. And here we have one last table. This one's kind of cool to look at. It's a bit hard to read at first, but you got the scores going down the left, the names going across the top, and then they're color-coded. So the more likely a score is, the darker green that cell is. So you can see Fabiano, 185 times he scored 8 points. That's his darkest green. And then it kind of goes up from there. Ding, 7.5 most likely. Nakamura, 7.5. Firouzja, 7. And there we see that kind of difference with Naka and Firouzja. Firouzja actually scored more often at 8.5 points, but his most common score was 7. So that's like the most common question I've seen on this article. That's why this table explains it. Nepo, 6.5 or 7, most common. Same for Radjabov, kind of leaning more towards 6.5, 6.5 for Poor, and 6.5 Duda. So these players on the right are expected to score a little below average. Nepo about average, and then Firouzja and Naka slightly above, and Ding and Caruana definitely above. So hope you guys enjoyed this article, kind of talking through the predictions. Let me know what you think in the comments. Who do you think is going to win this tournament? And if you have any questions on the article, put those in the comments as well. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.